Tuesday, August 7th, 2007. Slide behind me. Let me ask you all a question if I could. How many of you in the audience today remember what you were doing on Tuesday, August 7th, 2007? Probably not many of you. I remember that day very, very distinctly and vividly. And I want to share with you today a story about some personal grief I experienced. So it's Tuesday, August 7th, 2007. It's 3:17 p.m. I'm sitting at my desk at work. My phone rings. The caller ID tells me it's my wife. I pick up this phone with a smile on my face. She doesn't often call me at work, but sometimes she calls just to see how my day is going. This time is different. She's crying. She really can't get any words out, but finally I hear, Randy died. Randy is my brother. My brain immediately tries to process what I'm hearing. In a matter of seconds, I strangely feel some kind of sense of relief that I don't hear the names of one of my children or my grandson, and at the same time realizing what I have heard. Through my own tears, I choke out the words, "What happened?" She doesn't know. "Your dad called," she says. I tell her I'll be right home. Sobbing now, I find my boss on the way out and manage to say, "My brother died. I have to go home." On the 15-minute drive home, my mind presents me with all kinds of scenarios. Everything from denial, probably someone misheard something, to trying to remember the last interaction I had with my brother. Was it something good or bad? Something to remember him by, or words and actions that should be forgotten? But my mind wouldn't let me remember any of that. I wondered if I would have to pull off the road, the tears stinging my eyes, having a hard time seeing where I was going. So many questions going through my head now. Did Jill tell the kids? Will she know any more by the time I get home? How is my mom? I walk in the door, we hug, both of us still trying to process. I call my dad. He can hardly talk. The only other time I had even seen my dad shed a tear was when my grandma died many years before. He doesn't know much about what happened now. He doesn't have many details to tell me. All he can tell me is a deputy sheriff had knocked on his door and delivered the news because he was the closest relative they could track down. My brother had adult children, but was no longer married. My mom was out of town with her sisters for the day. It was before any of us had cell phones. This was almost 11 years ago. So there was no way to get in touch with her. It fell on my dad to call Randy's kids, my younger brother, my sisters, and me. Over the next couple of hours, we gathered at my parents' house, waiting for my mom to return from a fun day of adventure with her sisters. All of us sharing in a tragedy she knew nothing about. I remember watching through the living room window as my aunt's car pulled into the driveway, and my mom's puzzled look as she got out of the car, trying to figure out why all of her children's cars were in her driveway. Remember, it was a Tuesday afternoon. Really, really strange for her. And I remember my dad slowly walking to the end of the driveway to meet her as she got out of the car. And the look on her face as he spoke to her. And the weakness in her knees as he delivered the news and wrapped his arms around her. So over the next several days, the picture filled in, questions were answered. An autopsy revealed officially Randy died of an accidental methadone overdose. Now, this was 11 years ago, so this whole idea of an opioid crisis was not in full play in our society yet. And he had been on opioids for years because of chronic back pain brought on by an injury he had suffered during weightlifting, many, many years before that. One dose of the methadone gave him some relief for a few hours. A second dose, too close to the first, cut off his breathing and ended his life. But there was something else we all knew about Randy. Besides the methadone for the pain, he also had a prescription for lithium, which is used to treat severe depression. Knowing this, we of course wondered if the accidental was truly accidental. And to this day, only Yahweh knows the answer to that question. We all have or will have our own experiences of grief to share at some point in our life. And grief, even as 11 years have gone by, as I was preparing this, and even as I'm standing up here now, surely none of you have experienced this except for this brief snippet I'm telling you. And yet for me, the pain is still so raw and it's so emotional. It's a long time ago. I don't think of it every day. But when I am forced to think about it, that pain is still there, and I still deal with it. I grew up admiring my older brother. He was like my role model. And it was a tragic loss for our family. All right. So we're here this morning to talk about grief, to talk about survival, to talk about restoring hope. There's not one of us that will go through our life without experiencing profound grief of some kind. One of the descriptions I recently came across regarding grief is this: grief is a pain so deep that it can't be spoken. Think about that. Grief is a pain so deep that it can't be spoken. When we're in the midst of grief, our world momentarily loses all sense of stability. We often lose our ability to make sense of the very things in life that we previously gave no thought to. The mundane things that just sort of happen every day. We get up, we go to work, we come home, we enjoy our family, we watch something on TV, we go to a movie, we enjoy the culture around us. And then tragedy strikes, and all of that is turned upside down. Just like that. Sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes we know it's coming. And we certainly lose the ability to express the intense pain that's tearing our life apart at that point. There's a verse in Scripture that says, "In the same way the Spirit also helps our weakness. For you do not know how to pray as we should, but the Spirit itself intercedes with us with groanings too deep for words." There's all kinds of things people have said about that verse, but very much for me, that's a verse about grief and our inability to sometimes deal with it. And that's what grief can feel like, groanings too deep for words. Okay, so let's get into the mechanics of grief a little bit. There's a Swedish psychiatrist. She's been dead for many years now, but her name was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she's a psychiatrist at the University of Chicago. And she introduced a concept called the 5 stages of grief. Before that time, people, of course, dealt with grief, but she sort of encapsulated this into something, and an understanding that psychiatry and science and medicine still works with today. The interesting thing, when she introduced it, it had to do more with terminal illness and how people deal with their own terminal illness. And over the course of time, it was developed into a recognition of how people deal with not only terminal illness of their own, but suffering, grief over the loss of a loved one, and many other types of grief as well. And it was based on a book she wrote in 1969 called On Death and Dying. And what she found is that many, if not most people, experience these 5 very similar stages of progression as we process grief. Now there's some more modern science that has developed 7 stages of grief. And I'll briefly run over those after we go over these 5 here. The first stage is denial. I mentioned back here in my story, as a matter of fact, one of the first things that went through my mind was denial. Probably someone misheard something. This isn't real. Perhaps the terminal diagnosis is mistaken. Perhaps the death didn't really occur. The false reality of what was is preferable to the new reality of what is. We don't want the truth. We want to deny what we've just heard, what we know. Denial. The second stage that most people go through is anger. When the new reality is accepted, after we get past the denial, the anger comes to the surface and the hard questions with it. Why me? It's not fair. Why do I have to go through this? Why my loved one? He didn't deserve this. And as people of faith, sometimes our anger is then pointed at our Creator. How could He be so unfair to us? You know, I think about my experience here, and it was my brother. But for my parents, it was their child. And as I mentioned, one of my first thoughts was a sense of relief that it wasn't one of my children or my grandson. Because somehow that type of grief is even more profound. Sometimes when we're angry, we question everything we know about life. The third stage that many people go through is bargaining, especially applied to a terminal illness. Asking for reprieve from death or dying is nothing new. We have an example of it in Scripture. In 2 Kings 20, King Hezekiah asked for a life extension, and it was granted by Yahweh. I'll just read that a minute. In those days, Hezekiah was sick and near death. And Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, went to him and said to him, "Thus says Yahweh, set your house in order, for you shall die and not live." Then he turned his face toward the wall and prayed to Yahweh, saying, "Remember now, O Yahweh, I pray you, how I have walked before you in truth and with a loyal heart, and have done what was good in your sight." And Hezekiah wept bitterly. And it happened before Isaiah had gone out into the middle court that the word of Yahweh came to him, saying, "Return and tell Hezekiah, the leader of my people, thus says Yahweh, the Elohim of David your father, I have heard your prayer. I have seen your tears. Surely I will heal you. On the third day you shall go up to the house of Yahweh, and I will add to your days 15 years. I will deliver you and this city from the hand of the king of Assyria, and I will defend the city for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David." Bargaining with Yahweh. It's what we want to do when we don't want to accept the reality. So, denial, anger, bargaining. Then depression sets in for many people. Specifically dealing with the death of a loved one, this often takes on the form of, what's the point? Why should I go on? This loss I'm experiencing is so profound. Life makes no sense to me. I just want to curl up into a ball. I want life to go away. I don't want to go on. It's unbearable. It's no longer worth living. And then many times, this is the moment we truly come face to face with our own mortality and realize we too will sometime die. And then finally, acceptance. We come to a point, and almost everybody does, where we have an ability to embrace the reality. And that's a start to the emotional healing from the crushing grief that has broken us in pieces. There are some people who never get to the point of acceptance. And they live or die in stage number 4, depression, because they can't move beyond that. For some people, these stages of grief will take on this linear progression I just mentioned: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But for many more of us, studies have found, these stages are all jumbled together. We almost always start with denial, but there's some people, and here's where the 7 stages thing comes from, is talked about, who their first reaction isn't denial, but shock. And shock is different than denial. Shock is, it's more than denial. It just stops your whole system. And it's an unbelievable thing that happens in your life. So like I say, for most of us, these are all jumbled up. For some, we might experience several of them at the same time, or some of the stages may be revisited over and over again. We think we're past the anger, and we're about ready to get into that final acceptance that this happened, and suddenly that anger just flares up inside of us again. And we're back there, and we're trying to process all of this one more time. And some people don't even experience these 5 stages. So while experiencing grief has some commonality across the spectrum of humans, it's truly a different experience for each of us, a very individual experience. And so when we're talking to people and we're dealing with grief and we're hearing their stories, I think it's so very important for us to remember all of us have an individual experience. I'm a crier, so when my brother died, I cried and cried for days. And sometimes it came back weeks later. To this day, it's said in my family that nobody's ever seen my mother cry. And yet when my dad walked out to the end of the driveway and told her, and her knees did that, that was all the expression I needed to see to know what my mom was experiencing at that point in time. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about how the Bible deals with grief, the whole biblical experience. Because I think our society hasn't done justice to allowing us to grieve properly. And I think it's very harmful to us. In our modern Western society, the expectation is that after suffering loss and grief, our period of mourning will be quiet and brief. So it's acceptable to grieve for a certain amount of time, but no longer. And we have an unhealthy obsession with getting over it as soon as possible and getting back to normal. The sooner we jump to stage 5, acceptance of the grieving process, the better and less awkward it is for everybody around us. So at 3:17 on Tuesday afternoon, August 7, 2007, I found out my older brother, one of the most important people in my life, was gone forever. On Thursday morning, August 9, 2017, less than 48 hours later, the Human Resources Department of the company I work for called me asking when I thought I might be back to work. And I couldn't really blame them for what seemed to me a cold and personal call. I knew these people. I was friends with them at work, No hard feelings. But they had no emotional attachment to my brother. None. They probably didn't even know I had a brother before that point in time. They didn't feel my grief and pain. And as much as we share with other people our experiences, they're never going to quite feel what we're feeling inside of us. And it's so important to remember that. So they had a business to run. It's how society works. We keep our chin up and we move on. And yet here I was, less than 2 days later, still in the denial stage, trying to wrap my head around the loss. The biblical experience of working through grief is something very different. So we all know Moses and his importance to the biblical narrative. The Bible tells us he died when he was 120 years old, and we find this out about him. It says, the people of Israel stayed in the lowlands of Moab, where they mourned and grieved 30 days for Moses, as was their custom. 30 days. As was their custom. The entire nation. Now you can say, well, Moses was a great leader. Of course they mourned him, right? But we're going to see a couple of other examples that show that was how society worked back then. They understood the importance of this grieving process. Another spot, when Aaron died, we read the whole community learned that Aaron had died, and they all mourned for him for 30 days. 30 days. Life pretty much came to a stop. Necessities went on, I'm sure. But people are allowed their time. In the book of Genesis, chapter 50, we have the story of Jacob's death. After they mourned him for 70 days, according to Egyptian custom, because remember, Jacob had come to where Joseph was in Egypt. He had brought him there, and he died there. That he was buried, and it says of the Israelites then, when they came to the threshing place at Atad, east of the Jordan, they mourned loudly for a long time. And Joseph performed mourning ceremonies for 7 days. There's a biblical understanding that we need time and opportunity to just let it out. Just let it spew out. Let that grief, let that anger, let that raw emotion just come forth from us until it's out and we're done with it. To indulge that expression of our most raw emotion for more than just a couple of days. One of the practices that has become more prevalent in the past several decades in Western society is cremation. Now, from an eternal perspective, I don't have strong feelings about it one way or another, and we won't even touch that. But I do think that burial and memorializing a loved one by marking a grave is a means for society to gently continue the grieving process and that healing process over a period of years. My wife's mom is buried in a small cemetery in Bethel, Pennsylvania. She died long before Jill and I were married or ever knew each other. But every time we go out that way, we make a stop there to reflect and remember her. When we don't have those markers, those memorials, I think we prematurely cut off the grieving and thereby the healing process that we need for the rest of our lives. It's a strange thing in our society. Back to the story of my brother. Burial is a very expensive option if you haven't prepared for it. And I think it behooves us, because we don't like to deal with death and these kind of things, we often don't prepare, right? So because my brother had not set anything aside for his taking care of his own death, and his children were young adults, the best the family could do was a cremation. We didn't know what his wishes were. So out of that, though, all that his children got was this small urn full of ashes, which they scattered somewhere out in the woods because that's what he liked to do. And so that marker's not there. There's no way to go back and continue that grieving process. But we all have our own way of dealing with these things. And when we talk about grief, we're talking specifically about death today, and to some degree, terminal illnesses that maybe some of us have dealt with or thought we were dealing with and have overcome them. But grief comes just as emotionally and powerfully to some of us when we experience all kinds of different things. Some people experience severe grief after a divorce, after loss of a friendship, loss of a job, or loss of some prized possession, maybe a keepsake from your childhood or a family heirloom that's been passed down for generations. I think it's just important for us to remember that grief affects us in very individual ways, and I want to keep stressing that. Just because someone's expression of grief and need for healing doesn't make sense to you or me, doesn't mean it isn't real for another human being. Okay. What's the purpose of grief? What's the purpose of grieving? Earlier I mentioned the book On Death and Dying. In another book by the same author called On Grief and Grieving, there's a quote from the book that reads, "The pain of loss is so intense, so heartbreaking, because in loving we deeply connect with another human being. And grief is a reflection of the connection that has been lost." We think we want to avoid the grief, but really it is the pain of the loss we want to avoid. And it goes on, grief is a healing process that ultimately brings to us comfort in our pain. Grief is the healing process. That pain and love are forever connected. To avoid the pain of loss would be to avoid the love and the life we shared with that person. And then a quote from C.S. Lewis. The pain now is part of the happiness then. That's the deal, he said. The pain now is part of the happiness then. The reason you feel such intense pain now is because the happiness and joy you experienced with that person when they were alive. And he says that's the deal. And he goes on, to deny that loss is to deny the love. Grief is the main component of the healing of loss. You can't heal if you don't grieve. And that's why I think our Western society has brought a lot of damage onto ourselves. You know, we're filled with depression and we're filled with anxiety. And we have medications for all of this stuff. And some of us are into herbal remedies and all kinds of different things to help us through this, right? And I think a lot of this is in part because our society doesn't know how to deal with the hard things. And one of the hard things is how we grieve over someone's loss. And our inability to let that extend until it runs out in the person's life. You should never say to somebody, I think you've grieved long enough. You need to move on with your life. You don't know what they're feeling inside of them. You have no idea. No idea. Even if you've experienced your own grief, your own pain, your own loss, it's not the same experience that they had. My younger brother Kevin is standing back there right now as I'm telling this story, and I'm sure he experienced this grief in a very different way than I did. I'm sure there's some common things we shared with our brother, but we both had a different relationship with him. And I would never question how he dealt with that or deals with it to this day. So grief is the main component to the healing of loss. You can't heal if you don't grieve. In Isaiah chapter 53, we read this. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and like one from whom men hide their face. He was despised and we did not esteem him. Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried, it says of our Savior. Surely our griefs he bore, and our sorrows he carried. It says he was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And in John chapter 11, Lazarus had died. It says Yahshua saw her weeping, talking about Lazarus' sister. And he saw the people with her were weeping also. His heart was touched, and he was deeply moved. And he said, where have you buried him? And they said, come and see, Master. And it just simply says, Yahshua wept. You know, that one verse, Yahshua wept, it's a whole verse in most versions of the Bible. It's sort of like a trivia question it's been relegated to, right? What's the shortest verse in the Bible? Yahshua wept. But it follows this whole story about his personal experience with grief. A very human reaction. And in Psalm chapter 56, verse 8, David says, you have kept record of my days of wandering. You have stored my tears in your bottle and counted each of them. That's what David tells Yahweh. You have stored my tears in your bottle and counted each of them. Our Heavenly Father truly feels our pain, our grief, our loss. Our Savior knows what it is to experience the pain and raw emotion associated with loss. We have to understand that they understand us. There's some misconceptions, myths about grieving and pain. Some of the following information I got from a website, helpguide.org. It's an article about coping with grief and loss. So I want to give credit where credit's due for this section here. So I'm going to name some of these myths and the reality instead of the myth. Myth number 1, the pain will go away faster if you ignore it. One question I haven't asked during this presentation so far is, how many of you here in the audience have dealt with your own experiences with grief and pain and loss? Probably I don't need to say anymore, right? Because that's the truth for all of us. One way or another, we're not getting out of this life without dealing with it. Sometimes we experience it when we're young, sometimes not till we're older. But the older we get, the more people we know in our lives that experience loss, or we lose people we love. So, myth 1, the pain will go away faster if you ignore it. The truth is, trying to ignore your pain or keep it from surfacing is only going to make it worse. For real healing, it's necessary to face your grief and actively deal with it. Seek out whatever help you need. Don't be ashamed to go to counseling. Don't be afraid to just talk to somebody who will listen to you. Don't be afraid to let out that raw emotion and cry. Bawl your eyes out, whatever it takes. There's no shame in that. Man, woman, child, there's no shame in that. Myth number 2, it's important to be strong in the face of loss. Real grief, when we feel it, pretty much precludes feeling strong. We might be able to put on a show for somebody, but if we internalize that, it's going to tear us apart. Feeling sad or frightened or lonely is a normal reaction to loss. Crying doesn't mean you're weak. You don't need to protect your family or friends by putting on a brave front. Showing your true feelings might be a help to them and ultimately to you. Myth number 3, if you don't cry, it means you aren't sorry about the loss. Crying is a normal response for many people, but it's not the only one. Those who don't cry may feel the pain just as deeply as others who do. They may simply have other ways of showing it. The next myth, grieving should last about a year or any time frame. Put whatever time frame on it that you've heard. That's not the reality of life. We all process things differently. You know, when I was a kid, I didn't understand relationships very much and people getting married and people being widowed and that type of thing, right? But I remember hearing at some point in my life about someone who had lost their spouse. And it was sort of a traditional thing to say, at least in the circles that my family was with, okay, a year has gone by, he or she can start looking for a new spouse, right? It's appropriate now. In our society, I don't know if they still say that or not anymore, but it was a real thing. There was this 1 year time limit. And yet, for some people, that loss is forever. And some people, in 2 months, they might be ready to move on. I don't know. Moving on means, so just the point is, it's different for each person. The next myth, moving on with your life means forgetting about your loss. It's not true. Moving on means you've accepted your loss, but that's not the same as forgetting. You can move on with your life and keep the memory of someone or something you lost as an important part of you. And as a matter of fact, as we move through life, those memories become more and more integral to who we are as a person. They help define who we are, the people who have crossed paths in our life, the death. So just a few quick points about how to deal with the grieving process. To find a way to ultimately come to that point of acceptance, to pick up the pieces and move on with your life, so to speak. 1, acknowledge your pain. 2, accept that grief can trigger many different and unexpected emotions. Crying, hurt, anger. sometimes memories of happiness and love as you reflect on your relationship with that person you lost. 3, understand that your grieving process will be unique to you. Don't let people define how and how long you grieve. 4, seek out face-to-face support from people who care about you. For people who genuinely, truly care about you. For some people, that's going to see a counselor of some kind. For some, it's talking with your best friend. For some, it's having your spouse or your children or your parents there for your support. It's important to support yourself emotionally by taking care of yourself physically. There's I'll use my mother as an example again. After my brother's death, she got on with her life, and like I say, most of us, I don't think any of us ever saw her cry. But a few years later, my dad had a stroke, and he's still alive and doing relatively well today after, I think this was 5 years ago. But that brought out the grief and pain in a manner that we watched her lose weight, right? As she was dealing with this and having to take care of him and not taking care of herself properly. So when you're experiencing hard times, especially grief, make sure you take care of yourself the best you can. And finally, recognize the difference between grief and depression. Don't get stuck in that 4th stage where you're depressed and you're anxious and you can't get past that. If you're there, you need to get help the best you can. Finally, I want to end this with a verse from Revelation chapter 21 and verse 4, which is up on the screen now. And this is our ultimate hope. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. That's what our Father in heaven has in store for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Scott, and certainly a heavy topic for Family Builders Conference, but one of the things we discussed as a committee was that we had never actually talked about this, and as Scott so eloquently pointed out, it's something that everybody goes through and deals with in their own way, in their own time, and all of us have experienced that grief. So we've got just a few moments here. I'd like to see if there's anybody that has an immediate question for Brother Scott. And keep that brief if they don't. I just wanted to know, Scott, you had mentioned, and I know that this is sort of a difficult circumstance because, society is saying, okay, it's time to move on. Right. This person has, maybe developed a lot of damaging behavioral patterns. Some people, do a lot of different things when they're dealing with that grief. So right. How can a family member or somebody see that a person's in a destructive pattern of behavior, still dealing with the grief or in the depression stage or whatever? What do we do?
That's one of the most difficult things. And this, it's a difficult thing whether it's dealing with grief or some other destructive behavior in a person's life, right?
Sure.
I think it's important when, so some families deal with grief by everybody goes to their own corner, doesn't talk to each other, right? I think that's the most damaging thing we can do. I think it's very important to come together cohesively. The experience when my brother died, we all gathered at my parents' house. There's a few amusing things that happened during the course of that few hours. We decided we needed to eat while we were waiting for my mom, so we went out and got a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken for everybody, right? And so it's very important that you hold together as a family or whatever part of a community you are. For some of us, it's going to be our faith community. But don't push people away. And if you see one person isolating themselves, hopefully before they get to that point where they're just going through this destructive behavior, you're intervening and you're talking into their lives. Honestly, though, ultimately, just being honest here, if someone can't process that and get through that, there's only so much you can do. And sometimes it just takes some time and space. But if you see them go into substance abuse or anything like that, or know they have tendencies towards that, you really need to show love by intervening before they get to that point where they're going over the edge themselves.
Sure. One of the thing I was thinking of, during this thing is sometimes it's difficult for me to just know what to say to somebody who's, just experienced a tragic loss or whatever. And I was reminded of that passage in Job where his friends came, the 3 friends come, and didn't they sit quietly? No one said a word for like 7 days, wasn't it, or something? Yeah. It was an extremely long time.
Right.
And so I just wondered, is it okay to just, be there for somebody and not necessarily have to say the right thing?
I think that's, actually that's one of the most important things. And it's something I actually looked into in researching this topic. Sometimes saying the wrong thing is worse than not saying anything at all. Mm-hmm. And I understand, because sometimes we truly don't know what to say. But don't present cliched statements to people. Just because you've heard it before, think about it before it comes out of your mouth. Again, now here's the deal. You have to know the people that you're interacting with. Mm-hmm. If you're truly not a close friend with somebody, it's probably best just to say sorry for your loss and leave it at that. If you are a close friend or a family member, then hopefully you know what the right response is towards that person.
Okay, like I said, we have time for just one, maybe 2 comments. Can we get the microphone here in the middle, please?
I'm not trying to solicit anything. I do work at a cemetery, which does give me some, lead-ins to what you're thinking. And sometimes, people need to, they could, I don't know if every cemetery does it, but ours does. You can take care of things earlier, ahead of time, before somebody's gone or whatever, and then, because when there's death, your mind is not really there. Scott, you could probably attest to that very easily.
Yeah.
So if you have some things in order, you pay financially, get everything done and taken care of ahead of time, that's one worry right out of the way. And, whether it's funeral expenses or cremation expenses, whatever, they're done.
Yeah.
And it's a load off people's minds. So
yeah, I know we had to
find out, do some research.
We had to deal with that with my brother. He had, he was a relatively young man, 52, 53 when he died, I think. And he had nothing prepared, and we didn't know anything about this, And because his children were young adults, they decided I should be the executor of the estate and figure all this out. I mean, he had no will, he had nothing. And so besides what you're talking about, there's all these other financial things, and find out where he has maybe had money stored away, and people are coming for whatever debts he had. And there's this whole host of things to deal with if someone hasn't prepared properly. So I 100% agree with what this brother just said. Do what you can to prepare for that. So it's not a burden on you. Even if you're older, it's not on your children or whoever it might be.
Sure. Yeah. It's a great suggestion. Thank you for that. One more comment here or question?
I did have a comment and a question, if I may, but you asked about what you do with somebody who's in extreme depression, what to do when they recognize this. About 21 years ago, my grandpa passed away suddenly. And my grandma quit working because Grandpa had died. She didn't see the purpose in working anymore. And what I had noticed over a 3-week time period is she stopped getting up. She stopped getting herself dressed before the day like she commonly did, and she was just locked up in her home. So about 3 weeks after Grandpa died, I went over to her house, and I looked at her and said, "What are you doing?" And she's like, "Well, Grandpa's dead. What do I do?" I said, "You need to figure out something to do. You just can't sit here and lock away and die. You need to figure out something to do because we still love you and we still need you to continue on." And so I asked her to go back to work, and I said, "I want you to go back to work until you can figure out something to do. Grieve still, but you need to do something and live on. Otherwise, you're going to die just with a broken heart and depression." And she went back to work for a couple of years, and when she finally figured out what she did, she lived another 15 years beyond Grandpa. You know, when she passed, I was able to look at her and just be at peace with it, because she had died on her, she didn't let depression overwhelm her. The question I did have, though, was, and I think you kind of touched on this, was with suicide. There are a host of other feelings with somebody has been taken their own life.
Yes.
And I would ask that, what would be your help in somebody who has dealt with something that, because there's just, like I said, there's a host of other range of emotions going on with that.
Sure.
Yeah, that's you're right. That's absolutely a very, very much adds to the difficulty of dealing with it, right? Especially if you're believers like we are, and we have some sense that suicide is not an appropriate way to for someone's life to end, right? I'm going to be honest with you here a minute. I've done a lot of research on it, and I used to be hardcore. If someone committed suicide, they were out of Yahweh's grace. I don't go around saying that anymore, because it's not my place to make that judgment, first of all. But Yahweh knows each of his children. My brother was a believer like we are. He brought me into this movement, okay? And so sometimes you can spout things for years and years and years, and then you experience something in a personal way, and you have questions, and you really have to deeply think about what you're saying, and you can't just spout stuff anymore. All I can tell you is, when you have questions, when you know it is suicide or you think it could be suicide, I still think these same steps you go through apply. And I don't know of a better way to deal with it except to say, for others around people who go through this, be aware that the burden is even more than if it's some kind of natural death. But that goes for a whole range of death. If someone dies when they're 97 years old and they've lived a good life, people just go like, oh, Now, it's still an intense emotion for a lot of people that are close to them, but, that's sort of expected. When a young child dies unexpectedly, or even after a terminal illness, there's a different kind of grief that we go through that's very difficult. And so then suicide is a different thing too. And the only advice I have is to recognize that those are all different things, and we're going to have different responses to them, and be easy on the people around you.
Yeah, and I certainly think that there are many, so many things, other things that we could go into, and that was a great question. Yeah. So let's take the opportunity and appreciate Brother Scott for bringing such a difficult but well-delivered message. And appreciate you, brother.